Some moments arrive so quietly you don't notice their weight until much later. For me, it was the morning I stopped for the man on the bench. I didn't know his name, his story, or why he sat there every day. But from that single act of kindness, my life began to twist into something I never could have imagined. The bakery was still half asleep when I arrived in the early hours, but the ovens were already alive, their orange glow painting the walls in warmth. The air was thick with the smell of yeast and butter, comforting, heavy, like a blanket you didn't want to crawl out from under. Flour dust floated in the air, catching the light from the small windows high up on the wall. My hands knew the routine without needing my mind to guide them. Scoop the flour, press into the dough, fold, stretch, press again. The dough was warm beneath my palms, alive in its own way. I lined loaves neatly on trays, scored each one with a quick slash of the knife, brushed the tops with egg wash, and slid them into the ovens where heat would work its magic. By the time my shift ended, the racks were lined with golden bread and trays of pastries cooling under thin clouds of steam. I fetched a plain paper bag and began filling it with whatever wouldn't be sold. A crust that had baked too dark, a roll that had risen unevenly, a pastry whose edges had burned just slightly. My grandmother's words played in my head as they always did. Bread is never just bread. It's a kindness you can hand to someone without asking for anything in return. The bag was warm in one hand, a paper cup of hot coffee in the other, the cardboard sleeve rough against my fingers. I stepped out into the crisp morning, and the air hit my cheeks like a slap. My breath drifted away in small white clouds. The street was mostly empty. The occasional bus rumbled past, a lone cyclist cut through the mist, and somewhere far off, a metal shutter groaned open. And then I saw him. The bench sat against a brick wall that had once been painted red, but had faded into a patchwork of brown and gray, with strips of peeling paint curling like old paper. He sat there, as though the bench had been made for him. His coat, once brown, had faded into the color of wet earth. It hung loose on him, the fabric soft from years of wear. A thin frayed scarf wound around his neck several times covered most of his face, leaving only his eyes visible, eyes that were lowered toward his clasped hands. I had seen him there countless times before, always in the same position. I'd never stopped. I'd never spoken. But that morning, I did. I walked over, pulled a loaf of bread from my bag, and placed it beside him on the bench. I didn't say anything. For a moment, he didn't move. I turned to leave, but something made me glance back. His eyes had lifted just slightly, flickering to the bread, and then to my face. There was no smile, no nod, not even a whisper of thanks. But for that brief second, our eyes met, and there was something in them I couldn't name. The next day, I did it again. This time, a croissant, still warm from the oven. The day after that, bread and coffee. And so, without planning it, our silent ritual began. Every morning, I'd leave something beside him. Every morning when I passed later, it would be gone. He never ate while I was there. At first, I thought it might be pride or distrust, but slowly, I began to notice the small things. The way his eyes followed me as I approached, the subtle lift of his shoulders when I set something down, the way his hands wrapped around the coffee cup as if to soak in its warmth before drinking. Weeks passed. The silence between us became its own kind of language. I didn't know his name, where he went when he wasn't on the bench, or why he was there at all. But I began to notice the smallest changes in him. Some mornings, the shadows under his eyes were deeper. Other days, there was a faint ease in his posture, like some unseen weight had lifted just a little. I learned to read him in the tilt of his head, the way he tied his scarf, the set of his shoulders. One particularly cold morning, I decided not to leave right away. Instead, I sat at the far end of the bench, the wood hard and icy beneath me. At first, he tensed, as if he expected me to speak or ask something, but I didn't. I just sipped my coffee in the cold morning air. After a moment, I heard the soft rustle of the paper bag. He reached in, pulled out the bread, and broke it in half before taking a bite. Up close, I saw the details I had missed before. A thin scar along his jaw, the deep lines at the corners of his eyes, the mismatched patches sewn into his coat. He ate slowly, deliberately, like someone who had learned never to rush through a meal. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. But something had shifted. That morning felt like we had both silently agreed on something we didn't have the words for. Days turned into weeks. Frost turned to rain. Rain back to frost. But the bench was always there. And so was he. And so was I. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't love. It was something else. Something that belonged only to us. A quiet, fragile thread stretched between two people who shared nothing but a moment each morning. And then, one day, the thread broke. That morning, the air was sharper, biting at my skin as I rounded the corner with my bag and coffee. I was already reaching for the bread I'd set aside for him when my eyes found the bench. Empty. The scarf, the coat, the man, gone. And in that absence, I felt a hollow ache I couldn't explain. That morning, the fog was so heavy it felt like the city was holding its breath. The street lamps glowed in pale circles, their light swallowed almost instantly by the mist. I turned the corner expecting to see him, as I always did, hunched, scarf wrapped, coffee cup waiting for warmth. Instead, the bench sat alone, and for the first time, I felt fear for a man whose name I didn't even know. The cold hit me differently that day. Not just on my skin, but deeper, in my chest. I slowed my pace, my eyes fixed on the empty bench ahead. It was strange how much space a person could take up in your life without saying a single word, and how huge the gap felt when they were gone. I walked closer, half expecting him to appear out of the fog, but the bench stayed empty, the wood damp from the morning dew. I set the bread and coffee down anyway, the steam from the cup curling into the air like it was searching for him. Still, the unease clung to me. Instead of heading home, I turned down a side street, the kind I'd never had reason to walk before. My shoes clicked against the wet pavement. The alley smelled faintly of stale beer and rain-soaked cardboard. The first alley was empty. The second was cluttered with bins and crates, a stray cat darting into the shadows as I passed. Each time I thought I heard footsteps behind me, it turned out to be nothing, just the drip of water from a fire escape, or the whisper of wind through the narrow gaps between buildings. I couldn't shake the image of him sitting on that bench, the scarf wound tight, the stillness in his posture. In my mind, I could see every detail, the way his hands cupped the coffee to warm them before he took a sip, the way his shoulders curved forward, as if carrying a weight the rest of the world couldn't see. By the time I reached the small morning market, the vendors were setting up their stalls. The air was laced with the scent of fresh oranges and wood smoke from a nearby food cart. I spotted an older man arranging fruit into neat pyramids and approached him. "Excuse me," I began, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet market. "Have you seen a man, tall, thin, brown coat, scarf, sits on the bench near the bakery most mornings?" The vendor paused, squinting at me. "Quiet fellow." "Yes," I said quickly, leaning forward a little. He lowered his voice and glanced around before speaking. "Couple of days ago, I saw him talking to some men. Big men, in suits. Didn't look like locals. They stood there for a bit, then got him into a black car." My heart dropped. "Did he seem willing to go?" The vendor shrugged. "Didn't fight. But he didn't look happy either. Like he knew he couldn't say no." I thanked him and walked away, my head spinning. The thought that he might have been taken against his will twisted in my stomach. But another thought hurt in a different way, that he might have left willingly, without a word, without a goodbye. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator made me think of him out there somewhere. Cold, alone, or maybe surrounded by people I'd never imagined. People who knew him in ways I didn't. The next morning, I went back to the bench. Still empty. The day after that, still nothing. By the third day, my worry had hardened into determination. I wasn't going to let this be the end of our story, even if I didn't know what our story was. I searched everywhere I could think of. I asked shopkeepers, cab drivers, even the man who sold roasted chestnuts on the corner. Most hadn't seen him. A few thought they might have, but their descriptions were too vague to be sure. The city felt bigger without him, like the ground I'd learned to walk on had stretched out and left me lost. Then, one afternoon, I wandered into a part of the city I'd never visited before. The buildings here were tall and sleek, their glass facades reflecting the gray sky. Expensive cars lined the curbs. My footsteps echoed against the wide sidewalks. And then I saw it. A black car sat at the curb, its surface polished to a mirror shine. The back door opened, and he stepped out. But he wasn't the man from the bench anymore. No scarf, no worn coat, no bowed shoulders. His hair was neat, his suit tailored to perfection. And in that instant, I knew the quiet man I thought I knew had been hiding a truth far larger than I could have imagined. The man I had known only as a quiet figure on a weathered bench now stood in front of me, transformed. Gone was the frayed scarf, the sagging coat, the guarded posture. In their place was confidence, sharp, undeniable, and a presence that belonged to another world entirely. It was as if the man I'd been feeding all those weeks had been hiding in plain sight, and I had been too blind to see it. The fog clung to the streets like a second skin, muting the colors of everything it touched. I stood there, frozen mid-step, my breath a pale cloud in the cold air. The last time I'd seen him, he'd been hunched against the winter chill, hands curled around a paper cup of coffee, the edges of his scarf frayed like an old rope. Now he looked like a man who had never been cold a day in his life. The suit was the first thing I noticed. Charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, the kind of fabric that caught light like water. Under the jacket, a crisp white shirt and a silk tie the color of midnight. His shoes gleamed black and unscuffed, their polished surface reflecting the thin winter sun. But it wasn't just the clothes. It was the way he stood. No slouch, no shrinking into himself. He held his frame as if the street itself were his, as if every passerby was just another part of the scenery. His shoulders were squared, his chin slightly lifted, his gaze steady in a way that told you he wasn't afraid to meet or hold your eyes. My heart was beating too fast, each thud pressing up against my ribs like it wanted out. I took a step toward him, the sound of my boots on the wet pavement far louder than it should have been. His eyes met mine instantly. Recognition flickered there. A flash, quick but undeniable. Then something else followed. Hesitation. Calculation. As though he were deciding whether acknowledging me was worth whatever it might cost. I opened my mouth to speak, though I wasn't sure what I was going to say. I didn't even know his name. How do you address someone whose existence in your life had been nothing but small kindnesses and silence? Before I could try, a man in a navy suit appeared beside him. This one was taller, broader, with the kind of presence that drew your attention whether you wanted it or not. His eyes swept over me in a single precise glance. Not unkind, but assessing, as though he could weigh my intentions just by the set of my shoulders or the way I held my hands. He shifted slightly, standing between us, not in an aggressive way, but in a manner that made it very clear. Proximity had to be earned. The man I knew, or thought I knew, didn't try to move around him. He didn't call out to me. He just stood there, watching me as though the rest of the world had gone quiet. When his voice finally came, it was softer than I expected. "Thank you." 2 words. That was all. But they carried the weight of every morning we'd shared. The bread left on the bench, the coffee that steamed in, the cold, The moments where our eyes met, but our mouths stayed shut. Before I could respond, the man in the navy suit touched his arm, a subtle but firm cue. He turned toward the waiting black car, his shoes making no sound on the wet ground. Halfway into the back seat, he glanced at me one last time. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to make something twist in my chest. The door closed with a soft, deliberate click. I just stood there, the damp chill seeping into my fingers, the fog curling between us like a wall. The navy-suited man remained for a moment longer. Then he stepped toward me. His movements were smooth, deliberate, the kind of measured control that told me he had been trained to move without wasting a single gesture. From inside his jacket, he pulled out a card. Plain white, heavy stock. No name, no phone number, just an address printed in clean black type. "He wants to see you," he said, his voice low but clear. Before I could ask anything, he turned and slid into the driver's seat. The car pulled away, its tail lights fading into the fog until there was nothing left but the sound of the city waking up around me. The card felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. The address was in a part of the city I rarely went to, not because it was far, but because it belonged to people whose lives never touched mine. I walked home slowly, the card tight in my grip. My boots clicked against the sidewalk, each sound swallowed quickly by the morning air. My mind kept circling the same questions. Who was he? Why the bench? Why the disguise? By the time I reached my apartment, my fingers were numb. I set the card on the kitchen table and stared at it for what felt like hours. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. The next morning, I went to the bakery as usual. The smell of yeast and butter wrapped around me the way it always did, but my hands moved through the motions without thought. By the end of my shift, my bag was filled with unsold bread and pastries, but I didn't take my usual route home. I couldn't bring myself to pass the bench. Instead, I took the subway to the address. The building rose above the street like a polished mirror, each pane of glass reflecting a different shade of gray from the winter sky. Inside, the lobby stretched upward in sleek lines of marble and chrome. A receptionist sat behind a long desk, her smile precise and practiced. "Name?" she asked. "He asked me to come," I said, placing the card on the counter. She scanned it, then looked at me again. "Top floor." She slid a visitor badge across the desk. The elevator ride was silent except for the faint hum of the machinery. The mirrored walls reflected my own nervous face back at me. My coat still smelled faintly of flour and coffee, and I wondered how out of place I looked here. When the doors opened, a long hallway stretched out before me, lined with dark wood and muted lighting. At the end, a pair of glass doors stood open, revealing a view of the city that took my breath away. He was there, standing by the window, hands in his pockets, the skyline behind him like a painting. When he turned, his eyes met mine instantly. There was no hesitation this time. "You came," he said. "You asked me to," I replied. A faint smile touched his mouth. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. My voice was steadier than I felt. "You owe me some answers." "I do," he said, his tone quiet but certain. "And you'll get them. But first, I need you to know that what you did for me, all those mornings, mattered more than you could imagine." Something in my chest tightened. I didn't know what to say to that. Before I could speak, the man in the navy suit appeared in the doorway. "Sir, it's time." The man from the bench, the man in the suit, didn't take his eyes off me. "Tonight, 7 o'clock. The address is on the card. Come alone." The elevator doors closed, and the city began to sink away beneath me. In my hand, the card felt heavier than before. The numbers of the address now burned into my mind. 7 o'clock. Tonight. I didn't know what I would walk into, but I knew I wouldn't be able to stay away. I stood frozen at the curb, staring up at a building that looked like it could swallow me whole. Its mirrored surface caught the pale winter sun, and threw it back in cold, sharp fragments. I had no business being here, no map for the world beyond those gleaming glass doors. And yet, here I was, invited. My breath fogged in the air, and my fingers curled tighter around the small white card that had brought me here. The street was quieter here. No clatter of delivery trucks, no smell of roasted chestnuts or hot pretzels drifting from carts. The air felt different, cleaner somehow, like even the wind knew it had to behave in this part of the city. I tilted my head back, following the lines of the tower as they climbed into the sky. 50 floors, maybe more. The top disappeared into a pale halo of fog, as though the building were cutting its own slice of the heavens. My palms were damp inside my gloves. Every step toward the entrance felt like walking into another person's dream. A dream made of wealth, precision, and power. The glass doors slid open with a smooth whisper, and a wave of warmth met me. The lobby stretched upward in vast, echoing silence, its marble floor polished to a perfect mirror. My boots made the faintest sound as I walked to the long reception desk, where a woman in a black suit greeted me with a practiced smile. "Name?" she asked. I hesitated. I was asked to come. I placed the white card on the counter, the ink of the address looking stark under the lobby lights. She picked it up, glanced at it, and without another question, tapped something into her computer. A faint beep sounded, and she slid a small badge toward me. "Take the elevator to the top floor," she said. The badge was cool in my hand. I clipped it to my coat, my pulse already climbing. The elevator was glass-walled, climbing the side of the building so the city slowly unfolded beneath me. I could see the grid of streets stretching outward, the river a dull ribbon in the distance, the park bench, our bench, somewhere far below, invisible from here but sharp in my mind. When the doors opened, the change in air was immediate. It was quieter here, but not empty. The kind of quiet that comes from thick carpets, soft lighting, and expensive materials absorbing every sound. A man in a dark suit, not the navy one from before, was waiting for me. Without a word, he gestured for me to follow. We moved down a wide hallway lined with dark wood paneling and tall glass partitions. Each office we passed looked like it belonged in a magazine. Sleek desks, art on the walls, views of the skyline. Finally, he stopped in front of a set of double doors. They were made of frosted glass, etched with an abstract design that caught the light. He opened one and stepped aside, letting me enter first. The room beyond felt like a world within a world. The floor was covered in a thick, pale rug that muffled my footsteps. One entire wall was glass, offering a panoramic view of the city. Beyond the glass, the sun was beginning to slip lower, bathing the skyline in a cold, golden light. Near the window, a long table sat surrounded by chairs that looked like they had never been sat in. A few steps away, a desk stood, not cluttered, but purposeful, with a laptop, a leather-bound notebook, and a fountain pen resting neatly in place. And then there was him. He stood by the window, his back to me at first, hands in his pockets. When he turned, I was struck again by how different he looked from the man on the bench. The suit fit him perfectly, the tie knotted with precision, the light catching on the polished cufflinks at his wrists. But it wasn't just the clothes. It was the air about him. Authority. Control. And yet, when our eyes met, something in that polished exterior softened. "You came," he said, the words carrying a quiet satisfaction. I stepped further into the room, the door whispering shut behind me. "You told me to." A faint smile tugged at his mouth. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted, my voice low. "This isn't exactly my world." His gaze held mine. "It doesn't have to be. Sit down." I moved to one of the chairs near the window. The view behind him was breathtaking. The city laid out in every direction, small and intricate, and alive. But I couldn't look away from him. He remained standing for a moment, watching me as if trying to decide where to begin. Then he came to sit across from me, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped loosely. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint hum of the heating system, the distant rush of wind against the glass. Finally, he exhaled, a deep, measured breath, as though letting go of something he had been holding for far too long. "You've been wondering who I am," he said. My throat tightened. "Yes." He glanced down at his hands, then back up at me. "The man you saw on that bench wasn't the whole story. It wasn't even half. I stayed still, not wanting to interrupt whatever was coming. For weeks," he continued. "You brought me bread, coffee, simple things. You didn't ask questions. You didn't look at me like I was less than you. That's not common in this city." I shifted slightly. "I wasn't looking for thanks. I know," he said quietly. "That's what made it matter." Something flickered in his eyes. Memory, maybe regret. I didn't end up on that bench because I was homeless. I was there because I needed to disappear, and the only way to disappear in plain sight is to become invisible. You helped me do that, without even knowing it. My mind caught on the words. Disappear from what? His jaw tightened. From the people who thought they owned me. From the world I built, and the enemies it made me. I stared at him, unsure if I was speaking to the same man I had quietly shared mornings with. He leaned back slightly, studying me. "I owe you the truth," he said, his tone steady. "About who I really am. About why I was there. And about why I need you to know now." His gaze didn't waver, and in it, I saw the weight of something far bigger than I'd imagined. The city behind him glittered like 1,000 secrets waiting to be told. He drew in a breath, and the space between us seemed to tighten. "I owe you the truth about who I really am," he said, and I knew nothing in my life would be the same after hearing it. The man I had shared quiet mornings with, the man I'd fed without asking for anything in return, was not just anyone. He wasn't some lost stranger tucked into the edges of the city. He was one of the most powerful men here, a name whispered in boardrooms and printed in headlines. And all this time, I had been his only friend. He didn't rush into it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, elbows resting on the armrests, eyes on the skyline, as if weighing each word against the weight of his own history. "My name," he said slowly, "is Alexander Rains." The name hit me like a drop into still water. No splash, just expanding rings of recognition. I'd seen it before, stamped on glossy magazines, sliding across the bottom of news broadcasts. It was a name tied to skyscrapers, mergers, and billion-dollar deals. The words caught in my throat. "You're the CEO of Rains Holdings." His gaze shifted back to me, steady, without arrogance. "Yes." I sat back, the chair suddenly feeling too soft, too expensive under me. "So why?" I stopped, because there were too many questions fighting to be first. "Why the bench? Why the coat? Why all of it?" He didn't flinch. "Because I needed to remember what it was like to be seen as a man, not a position." The silence that followed was heavy, not awkward but deliberate. I realized he was giving me space to let the words sink in. "When you run something like this," he said, gesturing loosely to the walls, the building, the city beyond, "you start to notice how people look at you. They don't see your face. They see your name, your bank account, your influence. Conversations are rarely about who you are. They're about what you can do for them." I thought of his posture on the bench, the way he'd seemed almost carved from the cold. "So, you hid." "I stepped away," he corrected. "Voluntarily. I let my team think I was on a silent sabbatical, working remotely, overseeing from a distance. In reality, I was 2 miles from my own office, sitting on a park bench every morning. I wore what I could find in an old storage closet at my place. No phone, no meetings, just people watching. And no one recognized you." A small smile ghosted his lips. "People don't look closely at someone they think has nothing to offer them. His words landed sharper than I expected. I watched the city breathe without me. He went on. I saw what mornings looked like for people who aren't rushing to catch private elevators. I heard conversations about rent, groceries, jobs that barely paid enough to live. I saw kindness and cruelty. I saw people walk past others like they were invisible. I knew where he was going before he said it. And then one morning, he continued, you stopped. I remembered it clearly now. The cold air, the warm paper bag in my hand, the way his eyes had lifted just slightly when I set the bread down. You didn't ask me who I was, he said. You didn't ask what I had done to end up there. You didn't even wait for me to thank you. You just came back, again and again. I felt my face grow warm. It wasn't much. Just bread. It was more than bread, he said, leaning forward. It was proof that someone could see me, not Alexander Rains, not the man who signs paychecks, but me. And do you know how rare that is? The way he said it, low, almost vulnerable, made my chest tighten. I've been surrounded by people my whole life, he continued, but it's been years since I've had a real friend, someone who didn't measure me by my balance sheet. You were the only genuine connection I had in months. I didn't know how to respond. The idea that a man with an empire under his name could feel that kind of isolation. It was unsettling. So when I saw you again, when you saw me again, the real me, I knew I couldn't just let you walk away, he said. And now? I asked, my voice quieter. He studied me for a long moment, like he was making a final decision. Then he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I'm not here to just thank you, he said. His tone shifted, not colder, but more certain, the way a man sounds when he's already committed to the choice he's making. I waited, the air between us tightening. I'm here, he said, to make you my partner. For a second, the words didn't make sense. Partner? As in, what? Business? Personal? Both? What do you mean? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He didn't look away. I mean, I want you by my side, in my company, in my life. I want someone I can trust, someone who isn't afraid to tell me the truth, even when I don't want to hear it, someone who sees me the way you did when I had nothing to give back. I started, then stopped. That's not a normal offer. A faint smirk tugged at his mouth. I'm not a normal man. I let out a short, shaky laugh. And you think I could do that? Just step into your world like it's nothing? I don't think it would be nothing, he said. I think it would change everything. For both of us. I glanced at the skyline beyond him, the city lights beginning to flicker on against the darkening sky. Down there, my life was small, predictable. Up here, in this office, with this man, everything was different. I thought about the bench, the mornings we shared, the way I had always walked away afterward, never wondering if our quiet ritual meant anything to him. Now I knew it had meant everything. And here he was, asking me to leave behind the only life I knew to step into something I couldn't even fully picture. I looked back at him. Why me? He didn't hesitate. Because you're the only person I've met in a long time who doesn't want anything from me, except maybe to make sure I eat breakfast. The corner of my mouth lifted despite myself. That's a pretty low bar. You'd be surprised how few people clear it, he said. For a moment, we just sat there. The hum of the city filled the silence. Faint car horns, the distant echo of sirens, the whisper of wind against the glass. I don't expect an answer right now, he said at last. I know this isn't an ordinary proposition. But I meant what I said. I want you as my partner. And I'm not talking about charity or a symbolic title. I mean partner. Equal the word felt heavy in the air, bigger than the office, bigger than the city stretching out behind him. I'll think about it, I said finally. His gaze softened. That's all I ask. He stood then, offering his hand, not in the stiff, formal way I'd seen men in suits do, but in a way that felt almost personal. I took it, feeling the warmth of his grip, the quiet steadiness in it. "I'm not here to just thank you," he said again, softer this time. "I'm here to make you my partner." And I knew, whether I said yes or no, my life had already begun to change. When a billionaire asks you to be his partner, you don't know whether to run, laugh, or cry. In that moment, I felt all three at once, a dizzy cocktail of disbelief, fear, and something dangerously close to hope. The man who had once sat silently on a park bench now sat across from me in a penthouse office, offering me a place in his life, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But nothing about this was natural. My mouth opened, but words refused to come out. He had just said it again, as though repetition would somehow make it easier for me to understand. "I'm here to make you my partner." I blinked, still trying to find a foothold in the conversation. "Partner. In what exactly?" His gaze didn't waver. "In my business. In my life. Both." The words landed like a stone in my stomach, heavy and impossible to ignore. That's not a small offer." "I'm not a small man," he said simply, and while it should have sounded arrogant, it didn't. It was just fact. I leaned back in the chair, my fingers gripping the armrests like I might slide right out of them. "Why me? You barely know me." His eyes softened, but there was no hesitation in them. "I know enough. I know you saw me when I had nothing visible to give you. I know you didn't want anything from me except to make sure I ate breakfast. I know that when I looked like someone the world steps over, you stopped." The memory rose in my mind. That first morning, the paper bag in my hand, his stillness as I set the bread down, the faint flicker in his eyes, the days after when I'd simply repeated the ritual, never speaking, never asking. That's not grounds for... I trailed off, searching for a word big enough to contain the enormity of what he was offering. "For whatever this is." "It's exactly the grounds for it," he said. Shook my head, trying to clear it. "Alexander, I don't know how to live in your world. I don't belong here. I work in a bakery. My idea of a big day is when someone buys the last cinnamon roll before noon. And my idea of a big day," he said, leaning forward, "is when a billion-dollar deal closes without falling apart in the final minutes. But you know what? In both cases, what matters is the same: trust, dependability, people who don't let you down." "You think I won't let you down?" I asked quietly. "I think you already haven't," he replied. The certainty in his voice was unsettling. I dropped my gaze to my hands, twisting them in my lap. "This is insane. You can't just pluck someone out of their life and expect them to fit into yours, like it's nothing." "I'm not asking you to fit into my life," he said. "I'm asking you to share it. To stand beside me, not behind, not under the weight of his words pressed against me. It wasn't just a business proposition. It wasn't just about signing papers or making appearances. He meant life, all of it. Are you talking about..." My voice caught, but I forced the question out. "Are you talking about a relationship?" His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Yes. And no. What I'm talking about is a partnership, one that blends both. I want someone I can work with, live with, trust implicitly. Someone who knows me as both the man in the suit and the man on the bench." I stared at him. The bench. The suit. The impossible bridge between the two. Fear bloomed quietly inside me. "You don't know what you're asking." "I do," he said softly. "And I also know you're afraid. I was too once. Still am sometimes." I looked up sharply. "You. Afraid." "Every day," he admitted. "But fear doesn't mean you run. It means you decide if the thing in front of you is worth stepping into anyway." The room felt too still. My thoughts spun between the quiet gratitude I had known from him on the bench and the powerful, polished man in front of me now. They were the same person, but they weren't. A memory surfaced. One morning when I'd been running late. I'd nearly skipped the bench, thinking he wouldn't notice, but I'd gone anyway, setting the bread down quickly before rushing off. As I passed, I'd caught it, the smallest lift at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it came. Back then, it had been just a flicker. Now, looking at him across this glass-walled office, I realized it had been gratitude, not for the bread, but for the consistency, the presence. And now he was offering me, what? A seat beside him in a world I didn't understand? A life under the constant gaze of people who dissected everything they saw? What if I say no? I asked finally. He tilted his head, considering. Then we part as we began, two strangers connected by bread and coffee. But I think you won't say no. My chest tightened. Why? Because I think you already care more than you want to admit, he said. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Before I could answer, the navy-suited man from before appeared in the doorway, holding a tablet. He moved quickly to Alexander's side, speaking in low tones. Alexander's gaze flicked to me, then back to the screen. His jaw tightened. Well, that didn't take long. What didn't? I asked. He turned the tablet toward me. On the screen was a photograph, grainy, zoomed in from across the street. It was me, and him, standing together on the sidewalk outside the building. The headline above it blared in bold letters. Mystery Woman Seen with Alexander Rains. New Romance or Secret Deal? My stomach dropped. The image was already spreading. I could see the social media icons lighting up at the bottom of the article. The comments section was a stream of speculation, judgment, and curiosity. People were already guessing who I was, why I was there, what I wanted. I looked up at him, panic rising in my chest. They'll think whatever they want, he said, cutting me off gently. That's what they do. And if you choose to be in my life, they'll keep thinking it. Every day. I swallowed hard. And if I don't, they'll move on, he said, eventually. But I won't. The weight of the choice pressed down on me, heavier than any loaf of bread I'd ever carried, heavier than the air in the elevator ride up here. The man in the photograph looked nothing like the man on the bench, and yet, in both, there was something undeniably the same. A thread I couldn't untangle, a pull I couldn't explain. And now the world had seen us together. I set the tablet down, slowly, my fingers trembling. The photo was out there, the story already writing itself without my consent. When I looked back at him, he wasn't smiling, but there was no apology in his eyes either. This, he said quietly, is only the beginning. Overnight, I went from being invisible to being the woman every headline wanted to tear apart. The quiet life I'd lived, where I could walk down a street without a single curious glance, vanished in a single photograph. Now my name was being guessed in comment sections, my face plastered on morning news segments, my motives dissected by strangers who'd never met me. And all because of the man who had once been nothing more than a silent figure on a park bench. The first wave hit the next morning. When I walked into the bakery, my phone was already buzzing with messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Some were polite. Is this you? Others were invasive, blunt, almost accusatory. What's your deal with Alexander Rains? Are you dating him? How did you meet? By mid-shift, a customer I'd never seen before was leaning too far over the counter, pretending to look at the display while holding her phone just high enough to take my picture. When I confronted her, she just smiled tightly and said, "You're going to have to get used to it, sweetheart." By lunchtime, the tabloids had moved past speculation and into full narrative construction. I was no longer just mystery woman. I was the bakery girl who caught the billionaire's eye, a Cinderella story rewritten for clicks and gossip. But the comments, those were worse. Some painted me as a gold digger, already calculating how to cash in. Others decided I was a plant, some kind of PR stunt to soften Alexander's image. A few accused me of being The reason the bakery would raise prices, as if my presence alone could inflate bread costs. I'd never been so aware of my own face before. The lines of it, the way I looked when I wasn't smiling, the way someone could take one bad photo and make it mean something it didn't. My family found out the same way the rest of the city did, through the news. My younger brother called first, his voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Is this a joke? Tell me this is a joke." Then came my mother, less excited and more wary. "Sweetheart, are you sure you know what you're doing?" she asked, her words careful, but lined with doubt. Men like him, they don't just choose someone like us for no reason. And just like that, the seed of suspicion the world had planted began to take root in the people I thought would know me best. Alexander noticed before I even had to tell him. 2 days after the photo hit, I was ushered into his office again. He was already standing when I walked in, a television muted in the corner, a segment playing with our photo front and center. "You've seen it all?" he asked. "I've seen enough," I said. He nodded once. "Then it's time I stand beside you." The next morning, he arranged for us to be photographed together, not from across the street, but standing side by side as we entered a charity event. Cameras flashed, voices called our names. My heart thudded so hard, I thought it might show on my face. Inside, when reporters cornered us, Alexander didn't hesitate. "This is someone I value," he said, his voice clear over the hum of the crowd. "You can speculate all you want, but that's the truth." It didn't stop the rumors, but it shifted the tone. Some headlines now called me Alexander's confidant or unexpected partner. Others doubled down, insisting this was all part of a carefully crafted narrative. But the scrutiny began to wear on me. There were mornings when I couldn't step outside without someone following me to the subway. Customers at the bakery started treating me differently, either overly friendly in a way that felt staged or distant, as if my proximity to Alexander made me untouchable. And then, there were the interviews, sitting beside him under hot lights, answering carefully worded questions while his hand rested lightly over mine beneath the table. I told the truth every time, that we had met by chance, that I hadn't known who he was, that I hadn't asked for any of this. But the truth rarely makes headlines. Our bond, still fragile, began to bend under the weight of it all. We had gone from silent exchanges on a park bench to speaking in controlled sentences under public scrutiny. The warmth I had once seen in his eyes now had to fight through the shield he wore in front of the cameras. One night, after another interview, I finally asked him, "Is this worth it?" "To you?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "It will be, if we make it so." But the storm brewing outside wasn't just made of gossip. The first sign came in the form of a late-night phone call, not to me, but to Alexander. I heard it from across the room, his voice clipped, his answers short. When he hung up, he stood there for a moment, his hand still on the phone, his jaw tight. "Who was that?" I asked. He turned slowly, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly, but the shadow of it. "One of my board members," he said finally. And, he said, his voice low. "He just told me that if I stay with you, they'll move to have me removed as CEO." The words landed between us like a dropped blade, sharp and irreversible. Outside, the city lights glittered, each one a reminder of the empire he stood to lose. I didn't know whether to speak, to argue, or to walk away before I could do any more damage. And in the silence that followed, I realized the real fight was only just beginning. They thought I would be gone in a week. Another nameless woman erased from his life as quietly as I had entered it. They thought the headlines, the whispers, and the boardroom threats would send me running. And for a while, I thought they might be right. But then I made a choice, one that would change everything. For 2 days after the board's ultimatum, I couldn't think straight. Every time I looked at Alexander, the words replayed in my head. "If you stay with her, we'll remove you as CEO." They weren't just trying to erase me. They were willing to strip him of the empire he'd built to do it. I told myself it was proof that I needed to walk away, that leaving would protect him, protect the company, protect everything he had fought for. But the truth? The thought of disappearing from his life, of never seeing that quiet, unguarded look in his eyes again, made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain. The debate inside me was relentless. One voice said, "Go. You've had your moment. Don't ruin his life over it." The other whispered, "Stay. If you go now, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." At night, lying awake, I replayed the mornings on the bench, the sound of pigeons cooing nearby, the warmth of coffee cups in our hands, the silent understanding that had passed between us. Back then, we hadn't needed words. Now, the air between us was thick with everything we hadn't said. On the third night, I couldn't hold it in anymore. We were in his apartment, the city spread out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was reading something on his laptop, his brow furrowed, the light from the screen painting sharp lines across his face. "Alexander," I said quietly. He looked up instantly. "What is it?" I took a breath. "We need to talk about the board. About us." He closed the laptop slowly, setting it aside. "Go on." "I can't be the reason you lose everything," I said. If I cost you your company, your position, He cut me off gently. "You're not a cost." I shook my head. "That's not how they see it." His jaw tightened. "That's their problem, not mine." "You say that now," I said. "But what happens when the pressure gets worse? When they make you choose?" His eyes locked on mine, steady and unflinching. "I won't choose between love and leadership." The word love landed like a spark in my chest, quick and unexpected. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You think walking away is noble? Maybe it is, but it's also letting them win. It's telling them they can control my life by threatening what I care about." My throat felt tight. "And what if you can't fight them?" "Then I fight harder," he said simply. I stared at him. There was no arrogance in his voice, just certainty. The kind of certainty that came from a man who had built something from the ground up and wasn't about to let anyone tear it down. That night, I made my decision. I wasn't going to run. Not from him. Not from them. If they wanted a fight, they would have one, but not the kind they expected. In the days that followed, the chaos outside our walls didn't slow down, but something between us shifted. The conversations that used to be clipped and strategic became softer, warmer, threaded with the same quiet understanding we'd had on the bench. He started texting me small things in the middle of the day. A photo of the city from his office window, a memory from the park, a sarcastic comment about an overly dramatic news headline. I started leaving little notes in his desk drawer when I visited, handwritten reminders to eat lunch, or a quick "you've got this" before a big meeting. It wasn't grand declarations. It was small, steady proof that we were in this together. One evening, after a long day of meetings for him and endless stares from strangers for me, we found ourselves on his balcony. The city glowed below, its constant hum like a distant heartbeat. He handed me a glass of wine and leaned against the railing beside me. "You know," he said, "I've had partnerships before. Business ones, strategic ones. But I've never had one like this." "Like what?" I asked. "Where the other person could walk away tomorrow and I'd still be better for having known them," he said. I swallowed hard, looking away before the emotion in my eyes betrayed me. But even as we found this fragile rhythm, I couldn't shake the shadow of the board's threat. I started to wonder, why the hostility? Yes, his personal life was now public. And yes, the headlines were messy, but it wasn't as if I had committed some crime. There had to be something more, something deeper. The answer came unexpectedly. I was at the bakery one morning, wiping down the counter between customers, when a woman in her mid-40s walked in. She was sharply dressed, her eyes scanning the room like she was looking for someone. When her gaze landed on me, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're the one," she said. I frowned. "I'm sorry. The one who's been keeping Alexander distracted." The air seemed to thin. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," she said, leaning slightly on the counter. "And I think you should know. Not everyone in his life takes kindly to surprises, especially not him." "Him who?" I asked, my pulse quickening. She straightened, smoothing the sleeve of her coat. "Let's just say one of his board members has been waiting for an opportunity to knock him down. You've given him one." I stared at her. "Why? What did I do?" She tilted her head. "It's not about what you did. It's about who you are. And who you're not. Alexander was supposed to marry someone else. Someone approved. The board member you've upset. He's her father." The words sank in slowly, heavy and cold. She smiled again, still without warmth. "You've stepped into a game you don't understand. And in that game, people like you don't win." With that, she turned and walked out, the little bell over the bakery door jingling as if mocking the silence she left behind. I stood frozen behind the counter, my hand still pressed flat against the cool glass. The morning rush continued around me, but all I could hear were her words echoing in my head. This wasn't just about a CEO and a woman from a bakery. This was personal, and someone powerful had decided I didn't belong. It wasn't business. It wasn't about my qualifications, my background, or even my relationship with Alexander. It was revenge. Cold, calculated, and years in the making. And I had walked straight into the middle of it. The woman's words haunted me long after she left the bakery. I didn't want to believe her. I didn't want to believe that the threat against Alexander's position had nothing to do with public perception and everything to do with an old, festering wound. But when I told Alexander about the encounter later that evening, the look on his face told me it was true. We were sitting in his kitchen, the city's nightlights glowing through the glass walls behind us. She said, I began carefully, that one of your board members, the one who made the ultimatum, is the father of someone you were supposed to marry. His hand stilled on the stem of his wine glass. Slowly, he set it down. Her father's name is Richard Carraway. And, he said, his voice tight. He's been waiting for a chance to come after me for years. I leaned forward. Why? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the window, his reflection framed by the lights outside. My father built this company from nothing, he said finally. And Carraway. He wanted a piece of it, badly. My father refused, said he didn't trust him. Carraway never forgave him. I stayed quiet, sensing there was more. When my father died, Carraway tried again. This time he used his daughter. He pushed for an engagement, a merger disguised as a marriage. It would have given him a controlling share in the company. I was young, and for a while I thought it might work. But when I realized what he was after, I broke it off. And he's been holding a grudge ever since, I said. Alexander nodded. He's been biding his time. And now, with you, he thinks he has leverage. He thinks he can paint you as unfit, a distraction, a liability. The weight of his words sank into me. So it's not really about me, I said quietly. His gaze softened. It's about us. And about him finally getting what he's wanted all along. Control. I gripped the edge of the counter, the cool stone grounding me. Then we can't let him win. A corner of his mouth lifted. That's the spirit. From that night on, I stopped seeing Carraway as some faceless member of a corporate board. He was a man with a plan, and I had become the unexpected piece on his chessboard. I decided if he was going to target me, I wouldn't just stand there and let him. I started watching, listening, piecing together what I could about him. It wasn't hard. People talked when they didn't think you mattered. I learned that Carraway was ruthless, even by corporate standards, that he had quietly sabotaged deals just to weaken his rivals, that his network stretched deep into the city's politics and media, and I learned that he had been preparing for a takeover attempt long before my photograph with Alexander ever hit the news. My presence just gave him a faster route to his goal. In the middle of all this, Alexander and I found ourselves talking more, late at night, when the rest of the city had gone quiet. We'd sit on his balcony with mugs of coffee, the cool air biting at our cheeks, and he would tell me pieces of himself I knew he didn't share with many people. About how his father had been tough but fair, how his mother had left when he was 13, leaving a hole that work could never quite fill, how every success in his life had been shadowed by the question of whether it would be enough to keep the company safe, and how, in moments of quiet, he sometimes wished for the simplicity of the park bench, the mornings when it was just the two of us, bread between us, no one watching. It made me realize something. For all his power, Alexander was just as vulnerable as I was, maybe more so, because his enemies had more ways to hurt him. And now, because of me, they had one more. We decided we would fight Caraway together. Alexander began quietly rallying allies on the board, reminding them of the company's stability under his leadership. I reached out to people who might be able to help us understand Caraway's next move. Former employees, old acquaintances, anyone with a story to tell. For a brief moment, I felt like we might be getting ahead of him. Until the night it happened. It was a Thursday, cold and drizzly. I was closing up the bakery when my phone buzzed with a notification from a number I didn't recognize. Attached was a link to an article. The headline hit me like a punch. Insider claims Reigns' new partner involved in financial misconduct. My hands shook as I scrolled. The article was full of lies. That I'd been fired from a previous job for theft. That I'd been using Alexander to cover my debts. That I'd been spotted at exclusive parties with questionable figures. Every accusation was false. Every source was anonymous. But the damage was in the implication. By the time I reached Alexander's apartment, the article had already been shared thousands of times. He was pacing when I walked in, his phone in his hand. "I've already called legal," he said before I could speak. "We'll sue for defamation. I'll have the story pulled." But I could see it in his eyes. The same frustration, the same quiet rage I felt. Caraway had made his move, and we both knew it wouldn't be the last. I sat down heavily, the noise of the city muffled beyond the glass. It didn't matter that the scandal was false. In the court of public opinion, the seed had been planted. Caraway had drawn first blood, and I had no idea how far he was willing to go to finish what he'd started. They dragged my name through the mud, printed lies as though they were carved in stone, and dissected my life like it was theirs to own. But I'd learned something on that park bench. You can lose warmth, comfort, and certainty, but dignity? That's yours to keep if you refuse to give it away. So I wasn't going to let them take mine. Not Caraway, not the tabloids, not the strangers who thought they knew me. If they wanted a fight, I'd show them exactly who I was. The morning after the scandal erupted, I woke with the sinking feeling that the world outside my window had shifted overnight. The air felt heavier. My phone buzzed endlessly, the screen lighting up with messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some messages were short. "Is this you?" Others were laced with judgment. Wow. So it's true. A few tried to sound concerned, but even their sympathy carried the edge of curiosity, as if they couldn't wait to tell someone else about the conversation. On social media, my name was trending, though not for anything I'd ever wanted. Threads of strangers debated whether the accusations were true, dissecting my smile in photographs, guessing at my intentions. By noon, the bakery felt like a fishbowl. Customers came in with that same half smile, pretending not to look too closely. I could feel their eyes on me as I poured coffee, could hear their hushed voices behind me as they carried pastries to their tables. One woman snapped a photo over her shoulder, pretending to check her phone. My coworker caught her, but it didn't matter. The picture would end up online within the hour, captioned with some clever cutting remark. The headlines were relentless. Rain's mystery woman has a shadowy past, unmasking the bakery girl who captured a CEO's heart fairy tale or fraud. The articles pulled from anonymous sources, twisting scraps of truth into a story that made me into a villain. One claimed I'd been fired from a previous job for theft, a job I'd left willingly. Another implied I was drowning in debt and had attached myself to Alexander as an escape route. Every accusation was a lie. But truth doesn't matter when the lie is louder. For 2 days, I stayed inside. Curtains drawn, phone silenced. I thought about the bench, about how Alexander had sat there day after day, as strangers passed him without a glance. I thought about the stillness in his posture, the quiet dignity he carried despite everything. If he hadn't run then, why was I hiding now? Alexander wasn't going to let me disappear. On the 3rd day, he showed up at the bakery just after closing. He didn't say hello. He didn't comment on the whispers that followed him through the door. He just said, "Pack a bag." "Where are we going?" I asked. "To somewhere they can't get to you," he replied. We drove for over an hour, leaving the city lights behind. The property he brought me to was quiet, surrounded by tall evergreens. The air smelled like rain and pine, clean and sharp. Inside, the fire was already lit, the space warm and softly lit. It should have felt safe, but I couldn't shake the weight of the headlines still circling the world outside. That night, curled up on the couch, I told him I wasn't sure I could keep going like this. "Every time I think the worst is over," I said, "something new comes out. A new lie. A new headline. They want to break me, and I think maybe they're winning." His hand closed over mine, steady and certain. "They are not winning. And they won't. Because you're stronger than they think." I shook my head. "This isn't just about me. It's hurting you. It's hurting the company. Maybe I should just—" "Don't," he said sharply, cutting me off. His voice softened. "Don't say you should leave. They'd like nothing more than for you to give them that. You're not a problem to be solved, and you're not a liability. You're someone I care about. That's not negotiable." It was then he told me his plan. "We're going to end this. Not by hiding, not by waiting for them to get bored. We're going to tell them the truth. Our truth. We go in front of the cameras, together. We answer their questions before they can twist them." The thought made my stomach twist. "You think they'll believe us?" "I don't care if they believe us," he said. "I care that they hear the truth from us first." The next morning, his team moved fast. The venue was chosen, a grand hotel ballroom in the city. Press invitations went out. The podium was set. The drive there felt surreal. I kept my hands clasped in my lap, my nails digging lightly into my palms to keep my focus. Alexander sat beside me, calm, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. When we stepped into the ballroom, the space was already full. Reporters, photographers, camera crews. The sound of clicking shutters was constant, a mechanical heartbeat. Alexander spoke first. "I'm not here today to talk about business," he began, his voice strong, carrying easily over the low hum. "I'm here to talk about truth." He told them everything, how we met on a winter morning, how I had brought him bread without knowing who he was, how those quiet mornings had meant more to him than any meeting or deal. He talked about kindness, about connection, about how easy it is to judge when you don't know the full story. When it was my turn, I stepped forward. My voice trembled at first, but steadied as I spoke. I told them about the bakery, about my life before him. Ordinary, quiet, content. I told them I hadn't known his name and hadn't cared. I told them the rumors were lies. When we finished, the room was silent for a beat. Then came the questions, sharp and eager. Some wanted details about his company. Others asked how I'd adjust to his world. One asked if I was prepared for the level of attention this relationship brought. We answered what we could, ignored what we wouldn't dignify. And I thought, this is it. We've done it. We've taken our story back. But then, Alexander turned toward me instead of the exit. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something I'd never seen before. A quiet determination mixed with something far more dangerous to my composure. Before I could ask, he reached into his jacket, dropped to one knee, and opened a small velvet box. The crowd erupted, shouts, gasps, cameras firing so fast the air felt electric. I stood frozen, every nerve alive, the noise of the room fading until all I could hear was my own pulse. Alexander looked up at me like we were the only two people in the world, and in a voice meant only for me, he said, "Say yes." The ballroom was chaos, camera flashes like lightning, voices overlapping in a storm of questions and disbelief. And yet, in the middle of it all, his voice was the only sound that reached me. One question, steady and certain, cut through everything. And in that moment, I knew my life would never be the same. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. Alexander was on one knee, the small velvet box open in his hand. The light above caught the diamond, making it flare in a burst of brilliance that almost matched the heat rising to my cheeks. Around us, the press went wild, the clicking of shutters a constant rush, like rain against glass. Somewhere in the back, someone gasped audibly, but all I could see was him. "Say yes," he repeated, his voice low, meant only for me. My throat tightened. For weeks we had been fighting to hold on to something fragile in the middle of a storm, and now, here he was, asking me to make it permanent, right in front of the world that had been trying to tear us apart, wanted to speak, but my lips wouldn't cooperate. My hands trembled as I reached for him, and I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. The same fear I felt. What if I said no? What if the fight had already taken too much from us? But the answer was already there, deep in my chest. "Yes," I whispered, barely loud enough for him to hear. Then stronger. "Yes." The tension in his shoulders melted instantly. He stood, sliding the ring onto my finger with hands that were steady, even as mine shook. The room erupted. Applause, cheers, a few shouted questions about wedding dates and prenups. But I didn't hear them. Alexander wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close, his mouth brushing my ear as he spoke. "I don't want a life full of board meetings and headlines," he murmured. "I want a lifetime of the same kindness you gave me when I had nothing. No expectations, no agenda. Just you." I closed my eyes against the sting of tears. "You already have that," I whispered back. In the days that followed, the story exploded. The proposal video was everywhere. Morning news shows, gossip sites, even political talk shows debating the strategic genius or reckless gamble of his move. But something unexpected happened. Public opinion shifted. The narrative stopped being about the scandal and started being about the love story. Headlines read, "From bench to billionaire, a love story for the ages." Social media flooded with clips of the moment I said yes, strangers posting things like, "You can't fake that look in her eyes." The board didn't congratulate us. Not publicly, not privately. But they didn't move against us either. Caraway, for all his influence, couldn't fight the tide of public support. Removing Alexander now would make them look like villains in a story the entire city was rooting for. For the first time in weeks, we felt the pressure ease. The engagement period was a blur. Planning, fittings, meetings with a wedding coordinator who insisted on balancing grandeur with intimacy. I didn't care about flowers or seating charts. I cared about the mornings when Alexander and I could escape the noise, share coffee in the kitchen, and talk about nothing. We decided on a small ceremony, at least by his standards. Fewer than 100 guests, most of them people we trusted. The press was banned, though we knew they'd try to sneak in somehow. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright. I woke early, the light spilling across the bed. For a moment lying there, I let myself remember the bench, the way it had all begun. The bread in my hand, the cold morning air, the quiet man in the frayed scarf. And now, here we were. The venue was breathtaking, an old estate just outside the city, its gardens alive with spring blooms. Rows of white chairs lined the lawn, a simple arch of greenery and flowers marking where we'd stand. As I dressed, the room filled with the hum of voices, my closest friends helping with last-minute details, laughter mixing with the faint strains of music drifting up from outside. When the moment came, I walked down the aisle to find Alexander waiting, his eyes locked on mine. The ceremony itself felt like a dream. Vows spoken softly, promises exchanged, the kind of stillness that feels sacred. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, applause rippled through the crowd, and Alexander kissed me like we were alone, like the rest of the world didn't exist. We moved into the reception, the air warm with celebration. Glasses clinked, speeches were made, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we could breathe, until I saw him. It was near the edge of the garden, just beyond the cluster of tables. A man I didn't recognize stood there, watching. He wasn't dressed like a guest, no suit jacket, no tie, just a dark coat and a cap pulled low. Something about his stillness set off alarm bells in my mind. Guests moved around him, oblivious, but he didn't take his eyes off me. When I finally turned fully toward him, he smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and tipped his head slightly, as though acknowledging a secret between us. Then he slipped an envelope from his coat pocket and placed it on the nearest table, before walking away. I hesitated only a moment before crossing to the table. The envelope was plain, my name written in neat, block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature. Just one sentence. You don't know the whole story. I looked up, but the man was gone, swallowed by the crowd or the shadows beyond the garden. The paper trembled in my hands, its meaning a dark thread weaving through the joy of the day. Beside me, Alexander laughed at something a guest had said, unaware of what I held. And for the first time since saying yes, I wondered if there was a part of his life he had never truly shown me. He had never told me why he chose that bench. Not in all the months of quiet mornings, nor in all the late-night conversations since. But one stranger's words, delivered on the happiest day of our lives, ripped open a part of his past I never knew existed. And once I learned the truth, I understood that our story had begun long before I ever placed that first loaf of bread in his hands. The envelope sat on my lap for the rest of the reception, its single sentence gnawing at me. You don't know the whole story. I didn't tell Alexander right away. Part of me didn't want to bring shadows into the light of the day we'd just shared. But the image of that stranger, his knowing smile, his calm stillness, wouldn't leave me. When the last guests had gone and we were finally alone, I handed him the note. He read it once. Then again. His expression didn't change, but I saw the way his jaw clenched ever so slightly. Who gave you this? He asked. I don't know his name. He left right after. Alexander was silent for a long moment, staring at the paper as though it held a memory instead of ink. Finally he said, I think I know who he is. The next morning, we found ourselves walking toward a quiet cafe on the far side of the city, a place I'd never been, tucked into a street lined with small bookshops and antique stores. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and rain-soaked pavement. And there, in a corner booth, sat the man from the wedding. He rose when we approached, offering his hand to me first. You must be the one who changed everything, he said. His voice was warm, but threaded with something heavier. Sorrow, maybe. Over coffee, he told us his name was Samuel. He had known Alexander for years, though not in the way I expected. You want to know about the bench, Samuel said. I think you deserve to hear the truth. It began, he explained, more than a decade ago. Alexander had been fresh out of university, still learning the contours of the business world, still living in the shadow of his father's success. His father had been a man of ruthless efficiency, but he'd had one quiet ritual no one in the company knew about. Every Friday morning, before work, he would visit that park and sit on that very bench. Sometimes he would feed the pigeons. Other times he would talk with Samuel, who back then had been one of the park's regulars. "I was going through a bad time," Samuel said, his eyes far away. "Your father never asked for details. He just showed up, sat with me, shared his coffee. He said, 'Everyone deserves to be seen.'" Alexander's hands tightened around his cup. "One morning," Samuel continued, "he told me he'd made a promise to himself, that no matter how busy or powerful he became, he would never forget what it felt like to be unseen. He said the bench reminded him of that. It kept him humble." I glanced at Alexander, but his gaze was fixed on Samuel. "Then one Friday," Samuel said, "he didn't show. I found out later. He'd passed away suddenly, and the bench sat empty for months. When Alexander finally appeared in his father's place, Samuel almost didn't recognize him. He looked younger than his father had, but there was the same stillness in his posture. He told me he was there to keep the promise his father couldn't anymore," Samuel said softly. "To sit there, to remember, to see the people no one else noticed." I swallowed hard. "So that's why you were there that morning," I said to Alexander. "It wasn't just chance." He shook his head slowly. "I never told you because it felt private, like it belonged to my father as much as to me. But every morning I sat there, I wondered what he'd think of me, whether I was living up to the man he wanted me to be. And then I came along," I whispered. His eyes met mine, warm and unwavering. "And then you came along?" Samuel smiled faintly. "When you started leaving him food, I knew something had shifted. I could see it in his eyes. You weren't just feeding him bread. You were feeding the part of him that kept that promise alive." The weight of his words settled between us, not heavy, but solid. I realized then that the bench wasn't just where we'd met. It was where Alexander had been quietly carrying the legacy of a man who believed in the dignity of being seen. When we left the cafe, the city seemed quieter somehow, as though the air had absorbed the truth we'd just heard. We walked without speaking until we reached the park. The bench was there, weathered and waiting. Alexander sat first, patting the spot beside him. I joined him, our knees brushing. "I used to think the bench was a reminder of loss," he said. "Of my father. Of the people I couldn't save. But now it's where I think of you, where I think of what we've built, and where I know I'll keep coming back, no matter how much the world changes." I rested my head on his shoulder, the wood warm beneath us in the afternoon sun. "You kept your father's promise," I said. "And in doing that, you found me." He tilted his head against mine. "Or maybe you found me." In the weeks that followed, the noise of the scandal faded into background static. The board stopped its quiet attacks. Caraway, for all his bitterness, seemed to retreat. Whether from lack of ammunition or the realization that we were unshakable, I didn't know. Life settled into a rhythm. Mornings at the bakery, evenings together. And sometimes, on days when the weight of the world threatened to press in, we'd return to the bench, sit in comfortable silence, and watch the world pass by. It was there, one crisp autumn morning, that I finally put it into words. "I fed you because you looked hungry," I said, watching a pigeon hop between the cracks in the pavement. Alexander turned his head toward me, his expression soft. "But it turns out," I continued, "we were both hungry. Just for different things." He smiled then. That quiet, genuine smile I'd first seen under the frayed scarf. "Maybe," he said, taking my hand. "But now, we're full." The bench had been his father's promise, his way of remembering where he came from. It became the place where our paths crossed, where kindness asked for nothing in return. And in the end, it wasn't just bread that fed him, or love that fed me. It was the understanding that to be seen, truly seen, is the rarest gift we can give each other. If this story touched your heart, don't just move on. Hit subscribe now so you never miss the kind of real, powerful stories that stay with you long after they're told. And share this video with someone who needs a little hope today, because sometimes one small act can change everything, and yours could be next.